Hey everyone. Happy Sunday, January 29th. I want to talk a little bit today about fundamentalism. What fundamentalism means. I typed it into DuckDuckGo, which I'd recommend over Google. And there are 8 definitions just on the first search. So I'm going to read a couple of these. The first one's a usually religious movement or point of view characterized by return to fundamental principles, by rigid adherence to those principles, and often intolerance of other views in opposition to secularism. The second one is an organized militant evangelical movement originating in the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s in opposition to Protestant liberalism and secularism, insisting on the inerrancy of Scripture. This is the third one, adherence to the theology of this movement. 4 is a system of beliefs based on the interpretation of every word in the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, as literal truth. It is primarily held by a branch of American Protestants. Number 5, the belief or practices based on a rigid adherence to some traditional doctrine, extreme conservatism. Number 6, the tendency to reduce religion to its most fundamental tenets based on a strict interpretation of core text. 7, the belief that fundamental financial qualities are the best predictor of a price of an instrument. Okay. 8, the beliefs held by those in this movement. Okay. I mean, that's pretty heavy. So it's the reason why I bring up fundamentalism is anyway, I have a little visitor. So I had coffee with my friend Mike. We are he's planning to open up a dojo technically in a building. I'm trying to get one open in a church, but we take different styles and we want to work together. So we're trying to figure out how this works. I got there a little bit early, and so I brought my C.S. Lewis stuff, specifically the book Love is the Ultimate Apologetic by Art Lindsay. It's a very good book. It goes over the contrast between following Christ versus secularism and the New Age movement. So if you want to dive into that, reference should be below in the description. It's worth a read. So what I usually tend to do in books is I go through and I do mark my books up, not too terribly, but I underline them. I put a little notation on the side, and when I do that, I go through and then on my own little notebook, I write down the highlights of every book, and that way I try to put those to memory. That way I can maybe use them, not necessarily in a debate, but use them as a tool, as like a reference, kind of like how I use just about everything else like that comes off the cuff. Because ideally you want to make all of the knowledge that you read, all the good stuff you want to take with you and make it a part of you. So there's no point in just doing... I think one of the biggest issues with modern education is you do it just to get a degree. And then the degree gets you a job. And then you might forget everything you learned. Well, what was the point of learning all that stuff then? Just to get money? The point of education is supposed to make you better. That's besides the point. So I have this book, and there's this gentleman next to me. He sat down next to me at Starbucks. And he's like, "Excuse me, I happen to notice the title of the book you're reading. Can I ask you about that book?" And so I told him all that stuff, and he's like, "Oh, okay. I was a Methodist minister for a while." And we talked for a long time. I'm like, I really love reading, and I told him what I do. I try to encourage people and lead them to Christ because I think that's the best thing this planet has ever had to offer. I have another visitor. So it's the best thing this planet has to offer, so I want to point them to just that. And it turns out if people go toward Christ and the common denominator that is Scripture and follow the principles that he laid out, not the slogans, but the principles, and apply those to his life, he'll be fine. And eventually, as we were talking, my friend Mike shows up, and he sits down. He's very patient. He's listening to us talk, and he has like 10, 15 years on me. And this gentleman I'm talking to turns out he's 87. And so as we're talking a bit, Mike asks him, "Do you follow Christ?" And he's like, "Well, I'm very careful to answer that, because usually when you say Christ, you're asking like a fundamentalism term. That's like you put him in a box, and if you jump outside of that box, you are no longer a follower of Christ in my fundamental eyes." And I can understand that to a point. And there is a point. This is the whole encased in this is the whole concept of knowing exactly when too far is too far. It's like the masculine part of the masculine-feminine duality. The feminine part is the chaos. The feminine part's the creativity. That has to happen for life to continue. The masculine part is what holds it back from destroying itself. And it's like the containment walls of the garden in the Garden of Eden. So there's a point where like, okay, you can push the boundaries because you need to for things to grow. And this is like, what does a Christian look like in the year 1500, 2000, 2500, 3000? What does a follower of Christ look like as opposed to culture? Because you have to, culture just looks differently. But the principles that are core in the Bible, which are the highest, and that's per Nietzsche, the golden rule is the highest thing that has ever been given to us or we've ever come up with, however you want to look at that. Those principles should stand because they're eternal. The one of the enlightenments that the Book of Maps and Meaning gave me was the term sluagerum. That's where we get the word slogan from. It means battle cry of the dead. And that's true, I think, because if you take any slogan you've ever heard on a commercial that sounds good and you take it to its utmost conclusion, well, it doesn't apply to every situation in life, so it's not a principle. A principle applies to every situation in life. That's like, you love your neighbor as yourself. That works just about all the, actually, I would say all the time. You should treat, that's like something that's always running in the backdrop of the programming of your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as though you would have them do to you. Something like that. But love is actually better because love is proactive and it goes forward. Do unto others reactive. So you got to be careful with that one because it's like the eye for an eye mentality. Because the only way forgiveness happens is if one person decides not to give back the eye for an eye. That's the decision you have to make. So the reason I wanted to point out fundamentalism is because there's a lot of there is even the opposite ends, not necessarily Christians, but those that see Christians will judge Christians based on what they think their Christian belief should be, which gets very confusing. Because then you're holding them to a standard. You hold a religious person to a standard, first off, you don't know about, and secondly, that you wouldn't hold yourself to. And this is one of the, like you could read Frank Turek. Frank Turek has a book called, I think, Stealing from God, something like that, where every claim made by a postmodernist, or an atheist, or a secular humanist, or whatever you want to call them, every single claim that's made by them, they have to steal from God. They have to steal from the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's the source of it, because you can't just say humans have value. Well, says who? Like, you have to go to something transcendent in order to do that. So we talked a little bit, and this gentleman, this older gentleman, turns out his name was his name is Jay. There we go. And he also studied Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and I think Robert Maloney. If I'm probably mistaking that word. But we read a lot of the same things and Nietzsche, and he's just like, I'm like, wow, this is really amazing. It's very rare that I meet somebody who's read Jung. I only read the Red Book and Carl Jung Answers Job, and I read a good bit of Joseph Campbell. I have like 3 or 4 of his books, and he said those guys kept me going when the church itself was having this issue where, like, you step outside this box, you're no longer a Christian. Because any person who's been legitimately trying to find faith by following Christ understands that one of the first things you have to realize is you have issues with you that you can't even begin to try to stop. I just heard a story today about R.C. Sproul taking like 45 years to stop smoking cigarettes. And that's just cigarettes. And Nietzsche has a great idea, and I mean great in the sense where, like, it is a big idea that we can't even wrap our heads around or start to do. It's great. And that is, we should will ourselves to power and create our own values. We can't even stop smoking. We can't even stop eating sugar for like a couple weeks, and he said that's the only alternative to God, because it's the greatest gift that's been ever been given to us, is having the transcendent factor. So if you're going to reject that, you must create your own values, and the whole idea behind that is just so great. It's outstanding. So one of the things I'll give to fundamentalism is it can at points recognize when you've gone too far, and you can no longer be maybe called a teacher or higher up, or part of the higher standards of, those seeking truth. You can no longer be a mentor, that kind of thing. I think fundamentalism is good with that, but it has to grow with culture, because when you get a certain denomination, especially the Christian areas, the tendency there is they just stick with these rules, and then they don't pay attention to culture, so the rules do not grow and do not meld or mingle with them. You're stuck in like the 18th century, and you get certain ideas that you had about what is common don't really apply anymore. And the culture shock between whatever that world is and the world that is actually existing right outside your door, they just can't communicate. There's no relationship between the two. And you need relationship if you're going to have communication and you're going to have growth and you're going to have a communal species like the human race. So that's kind of what I wanted to go over today. I know I was going to go over Catholicism a little bit, but that was jiving in my mind. That gentleman invited me to his place. He lives 3 hours away, and he drove himself in Maryland. So I might go visit him because he said I have some books that are collecting dust, and it sounds like you could use them. And I'm like, heck yeah, dude, I love books, and I'll just keep reading them and reading them, and I will use them to better myself, to better my kids, and to hopefully better the world, because that's what education is supposed to be. It's supposed to help you live better. So anyway, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Take care.